First of all, thank you for giving us an opportunity to speak here, the Advanced AI Society. So I'm going to talk about the work that IEEE and the IEEE Standards Association more specifically are doing, and hopefully you will get something out of it. Yeah. Okay. Okay, a little bit about myself. So I am a country head and senior director with the IEEE. I'm based out of India. I'm located in Bangalore. I've been working with the IEEE for 13 years. Before joining IEEE, I was with the Motorola and Freescale Semiconductors. I worked there for 17 years and I'm a senior member of the IEEE. But the last point is most important. As per the bylaws of our institute, the views expressed in these talks are my personal opinion. Okay. So I do not know how many people are familiar with IEEE in this audience. We are the world's largest technical professional association. We have about 500,000 plus, half a million plus members around the world, based in about 160 countries. We are the trusted voice for engineering, computing, and technology. And in the, over the past decade, we have got into social impact of stand technology, and that's what I'm going to focus on in today's talk. We are also a publisher. IEEE is known for its publishing. We develop training programs. We do quite a lot of humanitarian work. And of course, today I'm representing the IEEE Standards Association. By the numbers, we work across all engineering spaces. Any branch of engineering you can think of, there will be a community in IEEE. And we have some very interesting communities on top of it. We have one community called IEEE Society for Social Impact of Technology. So, and we are taking this a lot more seriously today. We are not only looking at how to advance technology, but how is it making an impact? And if there are negative impacts, then how do we manage and address that? We have about 200 top periodicals and over 2000 standards either published or in development. So when we talk about the IEEE Standards Association, we are a global technologies and technology platform. We promote innovation. Sometimes I get this philosophical view whether standards inhibit innovation. I think that is somewhat perhaps similar to whether you overcook or undercook. How early is early for developing a standard? Having said that, we notice that development of standards is moving earlier in the research and development phase for several reasons. There are a lot of entrepreneurs today. Technology evolution is happening much faster, and also I think some fundamental standards like taxonomy definition, they need to be defined early on so that people when they talk to each other, they are talking the same language. And of course, everything that we do today, we want to look at sustainability. So as I said, we are about accelerating innovation. We also look at human values and ethical consideration quite significantly. That's very key focus today. But apart from that, we also are looking at a couple of emerging areas. One of the emerging areas that we are looking at is looking at children's data, and that's for people who have got some insight into it. You might know that that's a very complex space. A lot of young adolescent, young children are getting into online, and how do you manage the data around that? And along with that, going hand in hand, is how do we handle technology and data governance? I'm not going to go through the details of this. The bread and butter is standards development, but I want to touch upon a couple of things. One of them is what we call as pre-standardization program under the industry connection on the top left of your screen. The industry connection program is basically before we develop a standard, and standards development is not a cheap affair. It's quite expensive in terms of time, resources, everything else that goes around it, right? So we want to make sure that we are developing the right kind of standards, solving the right kind of problems. So a pre-standards activity brings people together to kind of roadmap the technology evolution, see what the gaps are and how do we address these gaps. Not all gaps might be addressed to standards, but once we recognize that standards can fulfill certain aspects of it, then we get into the more formal standards development process. And of course, developing standards within IEEE and the adoption of standards is done on a voluntary basis. Going hand in hand in the development of standards is also compliance to the standards. So we look at certification, and I will talk a little bit about it in the coming slides. We are open and transparent. Anybody can come and develop standards within the IEEE. We are consensus based, and we are a global organization, and it's easy entry for new technologies. So IEEE is a very bottom-up organization. Individuals come together, or entities, organizations come together to develop the standards. We have these two methodologies. However, we do recognize the importance that government agencies play, especially today in the world where data is so pervasive and the government is responsible for citizen data. they are certainly a lot more interested, a lot more concerned in some cases on what it means to deploy a particular technology into its society, and how does the standard handle certain aspects of the data. And so this gives a very good segue into bringing their viewpoints. So we have this government engagement program on standards, which allows for governments to be agencies to be observers into our standards development process. We have close to 100 plus participants across 60 countries. So now I will get into emerging areas, more specifically AI. So when we talk about emerging technologies, it is just the list is way too long, right? And it's interesting if you look at certain applications, all of all of these emerging areas can fit into one application. If you take an application like automotive, we are talking about IoT, we are talking about AI, we are talking about machine learning, we are talking about communications, materials, robotics to make the cars. So you can kind of see that there are several of these technologies that are coming together in one single application. And that makes it interesting as well as very challenging, because today, apart from being just multidisciplinary, things are becoming extremely interdisciplinary. And I think there you need to understand, when the standard is are evolving, how do you account for all these different dimensions, and how do you make sure that there are all these different perspectives that are coming in to develop a particular standard for a particular application. So this is a very important topic. So as I said, we are taking the social impact extremely importantly. So not only we are looking at technology advancement, which typically relates to functional features of a particular technology, like speed, latency, power, all those kind of things, but we are also developing this framework called tips, which is how do you build end to trust in devices and end to end systems, right? And what do we mean by trust, right? So the alignment goes through identity, privacy, protection, safety, and security. These are all key components that builds the trust in the overall system, and that's what I'm going to focus on in my next few minutes within AI. So there are various standards that we are doing when it comes to AI. It can be about communication services, it can be about the end application, AI in healthcare, AI in energy, and all these things are looking at the problem at different points of time, right? So if you look at taxonomy, right, so it's the very early cycle, it is more about governance. Whereas when you talk about the application, the concept of machine learning, how do you understand and train models? How do you verify? How do you validate those models? Those are all you are looking at it from an application perspective. And one of the things that is emerging in this very complex ecosystem is how do you do these things in a way that is efficient, right? For example, zero trust security frameworks, right? So where you can have no trust with your peer, but increase the confidence of the overall system with having zero trust on the other elements that are there in your network. So there are several such activities that are happening. These are all technical standards. You talk about large language models, you are talking about federated machine learning. There are quite a lot of stuff that's happening. But going aligned with this is what we call as the contextual or the socio-technical standards. So in the context of this, right? So today we are talking about a market that is probably, this was back in the day $2 trillion, but now probably $3+ trillion. And there are some research that we did which talks about the number of people using AI assistants in various forms and shapes, and these are all amazing. People are saying that 50% of companies that we researched, they are saying that they are actively monitoring AI created bias, right? And this is a very critical problem. And we can also see, if you look around the world, people are coming up with regional or national strategies, and this has only increased investments into the horizontal and vertical oriented AI systems. So how do you make sure that all of this is aligned? So one aspect of it is how do you keep the standards that are harmonized, but also now we are getting into a space where policies need to be harmonized. Okay, so about a decade back, we started this work called ethically aligned design. It was in 2016 we started this work. At that time, in fact, there was a lot of pushback. Why are we looking at this kind of a problem? I think it is one of the most critical challenges and problems that need to be addressed. And this brought together about 800 plus people around the world to look at the ethical impact of AI, right? So what did they do when we talked about ethical AI? They deconstructed the whole aspect of ethics. And here we are talking about technology ethics, we are not talking about morality. And what it did was, it was a pre-standardization activity which identified what are all the pillars that we need to form around when we talk about ethically aligned design. And then the each pillar was broken down into a set of chapters, and then the set of chapters gave guidance to what we call as recommendations and issues, right? So each went into a deep dive model, and they started looking at what should we recommend. The recommendations can be gap analysis and standards, right? So when we talk about EAD pillars, we are talking things such as the universal human values. What do we mean by agency of data? So it's very interesting views that people came together and provided their viewpoints. And of course, when you are talking about 800,000 people, and you are talking about a little bit of a view from the west, which is perhaps a little bit pessimistic and cynical, and a view from the east, which is taking a different lens of the same problem and trying to bring them together and develop consensus and produce a document that was highly impactful. And the first edition got published in 2019. And one of the key things when it got published was organizations started referencing or adopting this document into their own regular work. For example, OECD used this document for their AI principles. IBM used it in their organization for everyday ethics of AI. In fact, if you go to Australia and if you look at the Department of Industry, Science and Resources, they have developed AI principles, and those AI principles is exactly based on the EAD principles that has been defined in the document, and they quote this particular document over there. So as I mentioned just before, it gave rise to a set of issues and recommendations. So the recommendations manifested itself in the form of standards, but more particularly when we are talking about the socio-technical standards, we are talking referencing to a series of standards called the IEEE 7000 series of standards, and they looked at various aspects of this problem. At the top level, we were looking at model processes for system level design, and how do you incorporate ethics in the system level design. And the beauty of this standard is the ethical component that you integrate, we left it to the implementers, right? People come with different ethical systems. So the standard is developed in such a way that you can bring in your own ethical values, right? So sometimes this is also referred to as value based engineering. So the IEEE 7000 series of standards. So if you look at the each one of these standards, like 7001 looks at the transparency, 7002 looks at the privacy, 7003 looks at algorithmic bias. Then we looked at children and student data governance. That is super critical today, right? How data is governed for children. I have two kids. I get random calls from people about my kids, and sometimes I get worried that they know more about my children than I do. I don't know where the problem lies exactly there, but having said that, right? So it's a real problem. And then we have the same thing when we talk about standard for employer data governance too, right? So there are different aspects of it. We are looking at it. So this is the overall series, and I know that I'm out of time. Maybe in a couple of minutes I will wrap it up. So we have it, and 7012 is a very interesting standard. We download a lot of applications. So this is the machine readable privacy terms, where you talk to your device, and the device talks to the privacy, and then it says whether it's aligned with my views or not. So going along with this standard, we developed this compliance framework called IEEE certified, where we do compliance testing, and I will talk a minute on the next slide about this. So we mapped our compliance to EUAA Act. The EUAA Act has four levels: the minimal risk, limited risk, high risk, and acceptable risk. The IEEE certified framework has three levels, and we basically mapped it, and we did it in four verticals. The four verticals being accountability, transparency, privacy, and algorithmic bias. Each one has a set of criteria set, and based on the risk profile, a subset of these criteria we will consider. And we provided a training program around it called IEEE Awareness Training Program. It's called AIE, Intelligence and Expert. This is where people take, and either they can become assessors to this particular compliance framework, or they can have the model tested for this particular compliance framework. I will stop at this point of time. I believe that that gives you a fairly good view of the standards we are developing, not only in the AI space, but also in specific verticals, looking at children data governance and how you can actually provide compliance to your AI standards. So, with that, I will hand it back to the moderators, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to address the audience here.